Think the Wild West represented progress and civilization spreading across America? The reality is that frontier settlers were living worse than Romans did 1,800 years earlier. We're not talking about minor differences, we're talking about massive technological and social regression that killed thousands of people who could have survived in ancient Rome. Their struggle wasn't about taming a new frontier. It was about surviving conditions that the ancient world had already solved. And it all started with something Romans perfected. But the Wild West completely failed at not dying from your own waste. Sanitation in ancient Rome was sophisticated enough to support 1 million people in one city. The Wild West couldn't keep a town of 500 alive without regular disease outbreaks. This wasn't just a small step backward, it was a catastrophic collapse of public health knowledge. Romans built the Cloaca Maxima, a sewer system so advanced that major portions still function today. This massive network of underground channels carried waste away from populated areas, preventing the disease outbreaks that plagued less advanced civilizations. The engineering was brilliant, using gravity and water flow to keep the city clean. Public latrines in Rome were connected to running water that constantly flushed waste into the sewers. Multiple people would sit together conducting business while the water beneath them carried everything away. It wasn't private by modern standards, but it was sanitary and prevented contamination. The Wild West had outhouses, holes in the ground with wooden shacks built over them. Waste would accumulate in pits that were never properly sealed or maintained. These cesspools would leak into groundwater, contaminating wells and spreading disease throughout communities. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery killed thousands in Wild West towns because human waste contaminated drinking water. These diseases were spread through the fecal-oral route, meaning people were literally drinking water contaminated with sewage. Romans had solved this problem 18 centuries earlier. Frontier towns would dump chamber pots into streets. Waste would accumulate in alleys and public areas, creating breeding grounds for disease. The smell was overwhelming, and the health consequences were deadly. This was medieval-level sanitation, not the progress Americans claimed to be bringing west. Some Wild West towns had no sanitation infrastructure at all. People would relieve themselves wherever convenient. The ground around settlements would be contaminated with human waste. Rain would wash it into water sources, completing the cycle of disease. The contrast is staggering. Romans living in 100 AD had better sanitation than Americans living in 1870 AD. This wasn't because frontier people were stupid, it was because they prioritized speed and profit over public health, abandoning knowledge that had existed for millennia. But sanitation wasn't the only area where the Wild West regressed. Medical care was even worse. Roman medicine was surprisingly advanced. They had surgical instruments that wouldn't look out of place in a modern operating room. Scalpels, forceps, catheters, and bone saws were all part of the Roman medical toolkit. Their understanding of anatomy was detailed and practical. Roman military hospitals treated wounded soldiers with techniques that saved lives. They understood the importance of cleanliness in preventing infection, even if they didn't know about germ theory. Wounds were cleaned, instruments were washed, and patients were monitored for complications. Roman doctors performed successful surgeries including cataract removal, bladder stone extraction, and even brain surgery. The survival rates were surprisingly high for the era. They used opium for pain relief and had developed anesthesia techniques that made surgery bearable. The Wild West had doctors who were often just men with no training who decided to call themselves physicians. Some had legitimate medical education from back east. Most had learned by watching others or just making it up as they went along. Licensing and standards didn't exist. Frontier surgery was butchery. Amputations were performed with saws meant for wood. Anesthesia was whiskey or a bullet to bite on. Infections killed most surgery patients within days. The mortality rate for even simple procedures was astronomical compared to Roman medicine. Bloodletting was still common practice in the Wild West despite being discredited. Doctors would drain blood from sick patients, weakening them further and often hastening death. Romans had moved beyond this practice centuries earlier, yet frontier doctors clung to it. Patent medicines sold in the Wild West were useless or harmful concoctions of alcohol, opium, and random ingredients. They claimed to cure everything but cured nothing. Romans had actual pharmacology with tested remedies that worked. Frontier medicine was a step backward into superstition. Childbirth mortality in the Wild West was higher than in ancient Rome. Roman midwives had training and experience. Frontier midwives were often just whoever was available. The lack of sanitation and medical knowledge killed mothers and babies at rates that would have shocked Romans. The medical regression was so severe that you'd have better survival odds as a sick person in ancient Rome than in a Wild West town. That's not romanticizing the past. That's acknowledging that America abandoned working medical practices in favor of speed and ignorance. Speaking of working systems the Romans perfected, their water infrastructure made frontier wells look like death traps. Roman aqueducts are legendary for good reason. These engineering marvels carried fresh water from mountain sources to cities dozens of miles away. The Aqua Claudia stretched over 50 miles, delivering millions of gallons daily. The precision required was incredible, with gradients calculated to maintain flow without pumps. The aqueducts used gravity exclusively. Romans understood hydraulics well enough to maintain consistent water pressure across vast distances. They built bridges to carry water across valleys and tunnels through mountains. The infrastructure investment was enormous but paid off in public health. Rome had public fountains throughout the city providing free, fresh water to all citizens. You could walk a few blocks and fill containers with clean water that had traveled from pristine sources. The water quality was monitored, and contaminated sources were shut down. The Wild West dug wells wherever they settled, with no consideration for contamination. These wells would be placed near outhouses, animal pens, and waste dumps. Groundwater would carry contamination directly into drinking water. People would get sick and die without understanding why. Frontier towns that grew near rivers would dump waste upstream and draw drinking water downstream. The same water source served as sewer and water supply simultaneously. This guaranteed disease outbreaks that killed significant portions of the population regularly. Water quality in Wild West towns was so poor that alcohol was often safer to drink. Whiskey and beer were consumed not just for recreation, but because the water would make you sick. Romans drank water confidently because their infrastructure protected them. Some frontier settlements had no reliable water source at all. Water would be hauled from distant locations or collected from rain. During droughts, people would die of thirst or be forced to drink contaminated water and die of disease instead. The contrast is damning. Romans in 50 AD had better water quality than Americans in 1875 AD. This wasn't inevitable. It was a choice to prioritize rapid expansion over basic infrastructure. Thousands died because America forgot or ignored what Rome had proven worked. The physical structures themselves tell the same story of regression. Roman concrete was so advanced that their buildings have survived 2,000 years. The Pantheon's dome is still the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. The formula they used was actually superior to modern concrete in some ways, especially for structures exposed to seawater. The secret was volcanic ash mixed with lime. This created a chemical reaction that continued strengthening the concrete over time. Roman structures got harder with age. Modern concrete begins deteriorating immediately. We actually downgraded our construction materials. Roman buildings were designed to last centuries. They used techniques like arches and vaults that distributed weight efficiently. The engineering was sophisticated enough that many structures are still in use today, serving their original purposes after 2 millennia. Wild West buildings were thrown up in days or weeks. Wooden structures with minimal foundations would rot, collapse, or burn within years. Most frontier buildings didn't last a generation. The few that survived required constant maintenance and repair. The quality of construction was terrible. Gaps in walls let in wind and rain. Roofs leaked constantly. Floors were uneven and dangerous. These weren't homes built to last. They were temporary shelters that reflected the disposable attitude toward frontier development. Fire destroyed Wild West towns regularly because wooden buildings packed together created perfect conditions for conflagration. Entire towns would burn to the ground and have to be rebuilt. Romans used stone and concrete specifically to prevent this problem. The structural engineering knowledge that Romans possessed was completely absent in frontier construction. Buildings would collapse, killing occupants, Bridges would fail, drowning travelers. The regression in construction knowledge cost lives constantly. A Roman citizen from 100 AD transported to a Wild West town would be horrified by the primitive construction. They'd recognize it as inferior to what their civilization had achieved over 1,000 years earlier. The Wild West wasn't progress. It was regression. This regression extended to how towns themselves were organized and planned. Roman urban planning was sophisticated and deliberate. Cities were laid out in grid patterns with straight streets intersecting at right angles. This made navigation easy and allowed for efficient movement of people and goods. The planning was done before construction began. Zoning separated residential, commercial, and industrial areas. Romans understood that mixing these functions created problems. Noisy, smelly industries were placed away from homes. Markets had designated areas. Public buildings occupied central locations. Public spaces were integral to Roman cities. Forums provided gathering places for commerce and politics. Parks and gardens offered recreation. The city was designed for human use and enjoyment, not just economic function. Wild West towns grew chaotically with no planning whatsoever. Buildings were erected wherever the owner wanted, creating irregular streets that went nowhere. The layout was determined by whoever got there first and claimed land, not by any rational design. Saloons, brothels, and legitimate businesses were mixed together randomly. Residential areas were adjacent to industrial operations. The noise, smell, and danger from this mixing made life miserable. Nobody planned for livability because nobody was thinking long-term. Streets in frontier towns were mud pits in rain and dust bowls in dry weather. There was no paving, no drainage, no maintenance. Walking through town meant wading through filth. Horses and wagons would get stuck. The infrastructure was non-existent. Public spaces didn't exist in most Wild West towns. There were no parks, no planned gathering areas, no consideration for community needs beyond commerce. The town existed to extract wealth, not to provide quality of life. The contrast shows a fundamental difference in values. Romans built cities meant to last and serve citizens for generations. Wild West towns were thrown together to make quick money, with no thought for sustainability or livability. One civilization was building for the future. The other was exploiting the present. This difference in values extended to personal hygiene and public health. Romans bathed daily in public bathhouses that were architectural and engineering marvels. These weren't just places to get clean. They were social centers with hot and cold pools, steam rooms, and exercise areas. The largest could accommodate thousands of people simultaneously. The Hippocrates system heated water and rooms using underground furnaces. Hot air would circulate beneath floors and through walls, creating comfortable temperatures. This central heating system was sophisticated and effective, providing luxury that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. Bathing was considered essential for health and social standing. Romans would visit the baths daily, spending hours socializing while maintaining hygiene. The combination of hot water, steam, and scraping with strigils kept people remarkably clean. The Wild West had no bathing infrastructure. Most people went weeks or months without bathing. Water was scarce and heating it was labor-intensive. Bathing was considered an occasional luxury, not a daily necessity. Frontier people stank. The combination of sweat, dirt, and lack of washing created odors that would be intolerable today. But everyone smelled equally bad, so it was just accepted as normal. The health consequences were severe but ignored. Lice, fleas, and other parasites infested everyone. Without regular bathing and clean clothes, these pests were unavoidable. They spread diseases and made life miserable. Romans had largely eliminated these problems through their bathing culture. Some Wild West towns eventually built bathhouses, but they were rare and expensive. Most people never used them. The cultural attitude toward hygiene had regressed to medieval levels. Cleanliness wasn't valued or prioritized. A Roman citizen would be disgusted by the filth of frontier life. They'd recognize it as barbaric and primitive compared to their own standards. The Wild West represented a massive step backward in public health and personal hygiene. The food situation told a similar story of regression and loss of knowledge. Roman cuisine was diverse and sophisticated. They had access to ingredients from across their empire and developed complex recipes. Cookbooks from the era show elaborate dishes with multiple ingredients and cooking techniques. Food was an art form and a pleasure. Romans preserved food through multiple methods. Salting, smoking, drying, and fermentation all extended shelf life. They made garum, a fermented fish sauce that added flavor and protein to dishes. Their preservation techniques allowed for varied diets year-round. The Roman diet included vegetables, fruits, grains, meats, fish, and dairy in various combinations. Meals were balanced and nutritious. Even common people had access to diverse foods through markets that brought goods from across the empire. Wild West food was monotonous and nutritionally inadequate. Beans, salt pork, and hardtack were staples. Fresh vegetables were rare. Fruit was almost non-existent. The diet was heavy on preserved meats and starches with little variety. Scurvy was common on the frontier due to lack of vitamin C. This disease, which Romans had unknowingly prevented through their varied diet, killed and disabled thousands of frontier people. The solution was simple: eat fresh produce, but that wasn't available. Food preservation in the Wild West was limited to salting and drying. The techniques were crude and often resulted in spoilage. Contaminated food caused illness regularly. Romans had better preservation methods that the frontier had forgotten or never learned. Cooking methods were primitive. Most frontier cooking happened over open fires with minimal equipment. Romans had sophisticated kitchens with multiple cooking surfaces, ovens, and specialized tools. The regression in culinary technology was significant. A Roman would find frontier food barely edible. The lack of seasoning, poor quality ingredients, and limited variety would seem like poverty food. In many ways, it was. The Wild West diet was inferior to what Romans had enjoyed nearly 2 millennia earlier. This pattern of regression extended to intellectual and cultural life as well. Literacy in ancient Rome was widespread, especially in urban areas. Public schools taught reading, writing, and mathematics to children of all social classes. The ability to read was considered essential for participating in civic life. Roman libraries were public institutions that preserved and shared knowledge. The Library of Celsus in Ephesus held thousands of scrolls. Citizens could access information and literature freely. Education and knowledge were valued and supported by the state. Written communication was common in Rome. People wrote letters, kept records, and documented their lives. Graffiti in Pompeii shows that even common people could write. Literacy was a basic skill, not a rare accomplishment. The Wild West was largely illiterate. Most people couldn't read or write beyond signing their names. Education was rare and brief. Children would attend school for a few months if they were lucky, then return to full-time labor. Books were expensive and scarce on the frontier. Most families owned no books at all. Maybe a Bible if they were religious. The idea of public libraries didn't exist in most frontier towns. Knowledge was oral and limited. Written contracts and records were rare because most people couldn't read them. Business was conducted on handshakes and trust. This led to disputes and fraud that could have been prevented with written documentation. The intellectual regression was severe. Romans in 100 AD were more literate than Americans in 1870 AD in many frontier areas. This wasn't because Romans were smarter, it was because they valued education and built systems to provide it. The frontier valued immediate economic productivity over long-term intellectual development. A Roman would be shocked by the ignorance and illiteracy of frontier people. They'd recognize it as a sign of civilizational collapse, not progress. The Wild West represented a dark age in American intellectual life. The legal system showed an equally dramatic regression from Roman sophistication to frontier chaos. Roman law was codified, written, and applied systematically. The 12 Tables established legal principles that protected citizens and provided predictable justice. Laws were public knowledge, and citizens understood their rights and obligations. Roman courts had procedures and standards. Evidence was presented, witnesses testified, and judges made decisions based on law rather than personal whim. The system wasn't perfect, but it was far more advanced than what came after Rome's fall. Legal representation was available. Advocates would argue cases on behalf of clients. The wealthy had advantages, but even common people could access the legal system. Justice was imperfect but systematic. The Wild West had vigilante justice and mob rule. Lynchings were common and accepted. Accused criminals would be hanged by mobs without trial, evidence, or any legal process. The rule of law barely existed in many areas. Frontier trials were often jokes, a quick hearing with no real evidence followed by immediate execution. The accused had no rights, no representation, and no appeal. Justice was whatever the mob decided in the moment. Lawmen were often as criminal as the outlaws they pursued. Sheriffs and marshals would abuse their power, take bribes, and commit crimes themselves. The badge didn't represent law and order, it represented whoever was toughest and most willing to use violence. Property rights were determined by force. Land disputes were settled through intimidation and violence rather than legal process. The strongest took what they wanted, and the weak had no recourse. A Roman citizen would recognize frontier justice as barbarism. They'd lived under a legal system that, while imperfect, was far superior to the lawless chaos of the Wild West. The regression from Roman law to frontier violence represented a collapse of civilization. The infrastructure for movement and commerce showed the same pattern. Roman roads were engineering masterpieces that lasted centuries. Built with multiple layers of materials, proper drainage, and careful grading, these roads could handle heavy traffic in all weather. Many are still in use today, 2,000 years later. The road network connected the entire empire. You could travel from Britain to Egypt on Roman roads. Milestones marked distances, and the roads were maintained by the state. Travel was relatively safe and efficient. Roman roads were paved with stone, creating smooth surfaces that didn't turn to mud in rain. The engineering included crowned surfaces for drainage and ditches alongside to carry water away. The attention to detail ensured longevity and usability. Wild West trails were dirt tracks that became impassable in bad weather. Rain turned them into mud pits where wagons would get stuck for days. Dry weather created dust clouds that choked travelers. There was no maintenance or improvement. Bridges in the Wild West were crude wooden structures that washed away regularly. Rivers had to be forded, risking drowning and loss of goods. The infrastructure for crossing obstacles was primitive and dangerous. Travel times in the Wild West were unpredictable and slow. What might take days could take weeks if weather was bad or obstacles were encountered. Romans could predict travel times accurately because their roads were reliable. The lack of road infrastructure isolated frontier communities and made commerce difficult. Goods were expensive because transportation was so challenging. Romans had solved these problems with their road network, but America had to relearn these lessons. A Roman engineer would be appalled by frontier roads. They'd recognize them as inferior to what their civilization had built nearly 2 millennia earlier. The Wild West represented a massive regression in transportation infrastructure. Even the financial system showed how far civilization had fallen. Romans had a sophisticated banking system with loans, deposits, and money transfers. Banks operated across the empire, allowing merchants to conduct business without carrying large amounts of coin. Letters of credit could be used in distant cities. Roman currency was standardized and trusted. Coins had consistent weight and purity. The monetary system facilitated trade across vast distances. Economic activity was supported by reliable financial infrastructure. The Wild West had chaos masquerading as finance. Multiple currencies circulated simultaneously. Gold dust, various coins, and paper money from banks of questionable stability all competed. Nobody knew what anything was really worth. Banks failed constantly, wiping out depositors' savings. There was no insurance or protection. Your money could disappear overnight if the bank collapsed or the banker fled. Trust in financial institutions was minimal and justified. Credit was informal and based on personal relationships. Interest rates were outrageous. The lack of regulated banking meant exploitation was common. Romans had developed better financial systems that the frontier had abandoned. So there you have it. The Wild West wasn't more advanced than ancient Rome. In almost every measurable way, it was a massive step backward. Worse sanitation, worse medicine, worse infrastructure, worse everything. The frontier represented regression, not progress. Makes you question the mythology of American expansion, doesn't it? Those Romans would be horrified by frontier conditions. They'd recognize it as barbarism, not civilization. The Wild West wasn't the future. It was a temporary return to a darker past that America eventually moved beyond. But for decades, Americans lived worse than Romans had nearly 2,000 years earlier, and thousands died because of it.